I ended the previous video showing you how not to install the upper air defense platform on top of the torpedo control position. There is an error in this area of the superstructure. Essentially, this platform needs to be moved further back, and in addition to that, the platform is about 1 millimeter too long. Due to its extra length, it means there isn't sufficient space to install a ladder from the top of the torpedo control position to the deck for the torpedo control position. Fortunately, I don't think it's going to be very difficult to shorten the upper air defense platform. This front face is straight, and these balustrades are very simple. It's going to be a simple matter of cutting 1 millimeter off of the front and then reconstructing the balustrades in the new location. This step over here is also problematic and will need to be bulked up to the height of the upper air defense platform's deck. That can be easily achieved with plastic stock. To start the modifications, I will cut 1 millimeter off the front of the upper air defense platform. I think the easiest way to remove the front of this air defense platform is to use a saw.
I'm going to start the cut with the thick saw. It is stiffer. It won't bend as easily, but it does have rather large teeth that can cause it to get stuck on edges. Although, at least at the start, I don't have to worry about that since I am cutting it from the base, where there is a nice large flat surface. Once I get down to the splinter shields, I might need to switch to my thin saw with finer teeth. As I suspected, it did start to grip, so I switched it out for this thin blade with fine teeth. All said though, it did cut off rather easily. It's not perfectly straight, so I'm going to need to straighten that out. The easiest way for me to do that is by some careful sanding. Once I'm happy with the cut face, I now need to select some plastic stock to reconstruct the balustrade. This plastic stock seems to be about the right height, so I'll cut off a section. I now have a choice for how to install this plastic stock. I could pre-cut it so that they are equal lengths and then glue it down, or I could glue it down as is and then cut the gap in later. Since from past experience I know it's not difficult to cut a gap into this splinter shield, I decided to install it as a single piece first and then cut the gap later. This will help ensure that the splinter shield's height and orientation are equal when viewed from the front. I glue the splinter shield in place using extra thin plastic cement. While it is drying, I do a test fit to ensure that there is a sufficient gap between the air defense platform and the torpedo control position deck. There is a gap, but it is just a little bit too small. Fortunately, this splinter shield that I've installed on the front of the air defense platform is quite thick, so I can sand it down a bit more, and that should open up that gap just enough for me to more comfortably fit the ladder in. So after waiting for the glue to dry, I clip the splinter shield to length and then sand the surface down. Once happy with the thickness of the splinter shield, I clean up the edges using a file. Now I need to cut out the opening. My experience with this thin saw with the fine teeth has been quite good for cutting splinter shields, so I'm going to use it again over here to cut the initial edge for the splinter shield. It works far better than a knife for clippers because it doesn't push plastic out of the way. And it gives quite a nice clean cut because the teeth are very small. After cutting the new splinter shield all the way to the base, I am then able to simply pull it off using tweezers. Another quick test fit with the legs for the tripod mast in place shows that everything fits very nicely. This means that it is now time to fix the deck in front of the air defense platform. It needs to be raised up so that it is at the same height as the deck for the upper air defense platform. The gap between the front of the torpedo control position and the start of the upper air defense platform is exactly 2 millimeters, and I happen to have 2 millimeter by 0.5 millimeter plastic stock, so I cut a section to length and glue it in place. Unfortunately, after gluing down this strip, I discovered that it is just not tall enough, and there's still a small step up to the deck for the rear air defense platform. It needs to be raised up another 1/4 millimeter. Unfortunately, I don't have 2 millimeter by 0.25 millimeter styrene stock, so I'm going to have to build the next level of this deck using multiple sections of styrene stock. I start by gluing down a 1 millimeter by 0.25 millimeter strip, and then I position the upper air defense platform on top of the torpedo control position, Since the splinter shields for the upper air defense platform go all the way down to the deck, there is a small gap between the edge of the deck of the upper air defense platform and these plastic strips that I've been installing. That gap is approximately 0.5 millimeter. I then cut a section of 1.5 millimeter styrene stock to fill the gap between the 1 millimeter styrene stock at the front of the torpedo control position and go into the notch all the way to the deck for the upper air defense platform. While holding the upper air defense platform in place, I glue the section of styrene stock into position. This now creates a notch which perfectly centers the upper air defense platform. At this point, I don't want to glue down the upper air defense platform because I know I'm going to need to fill gaps and sand in this area, and having it glued down will just make it be in the way. So if I can complete the installation of this section of deck while still being able to remove the upper air defense platform, it is going to make things a little bit easier for me later on. After installing that section, there are just a few small gaps on the corners that need to be filled in with 0.5 millimeter styrene stock. I'm not going to bother with trying to cut them to the exact length. I'll cut them long and then glue them in place. This area is going to have to be filled with putty and sand anyway, so it won't be a big deal to correct this at a later time. Once everything is dried, I do cut them to length and then fill the gaps with plastic putty. In the previous video, I was a bit overzealous with cutting this notch and it did damage the deck a bit. So I'm also going to fill that in and just smooth out the deck for the forward air defense platform. There was a slight channel over there. I would like to get rid of that if I can. Once all the putty had dried, I then filed and sanded off the excess and then prepared the area for surfacer. The surfacer is going to hide micro scratches and reveal any substantial defects that I need to correct. Fortunately, I did a good job and there aren't any corrections that I need to make. So I then moved on to painting the splinter shields and bulkheads in XF53, the color of Hood's superstructure. Since I had sprayed this area again, I now need to go back and repaint the windows in black. As I did in the previous video, I paint them using black panel line, and the excess that escapes I then paint over with XF53. Since I already have paint in the airbrush, this time I sprayed over it instead of painting it with a brush. Simply by holding the component at an angle, I'm able to spray over the gap and not put paint into the window, but perfectly cover the exterior face of the bulkhead. Now that I'm happy with the section of deck that sits on top of the torpedo control position and in front of the upper air defense platform, I'm now happy to glue down the upper air defense platform. In doing this, I once again introduce another seam line, but this is a simple one to access without the tripod legs installed at the rear. And if I go lightly on the plastic putty, it won't be too difficult to remove. I'll also be careful not to put any of this putty on the splinter shields so that I don't need to repaint them. At this point, I have not yet repainted the deck. The deck needs to be painted in XF82. Currently, they are sprayed in XF53, the color that I sprayed the splinter shields. I also suspect that the forward leg of the tripod mast is going to have to be moved. So the notch that's in the upper air defense platform deck for the forward leg of the tripod mast needs to be filled. I'll also fill that using plastic putty. Once the putty has dried, the excess is then removed using a file and sandpaper. During this process, I did damage the paint on the splinter shields a little bit, so I touched that up using a brush with XF53, and then mask off the area so that I can spray the deck in XF82. As I spray the deck with XF82, the join lines disappear, and all the putty and glue gets normalized into a single shade of color, and we are left with a nice, clean, flat surface. I can now go about reinstalling the forward support pillars in their correct location. Previously, I had short pillars that terminated on the top of the transversal bulkhead between the compass position and the torpedo control position. They should in fact go all the way down to the deck of the torpedo control position. Now that the upper air defense platform starts further back, this is possible. As before, I use approximately 0.5 millimeter diameter brass wire as the support pillars. Once cut and filed to the appropriate length, I paint the base of the pillar in XF53 so I don't have to worry about masking and the deck. I wedge the support pillars in position under the forward corners of the upper air defense platform and glue them in place using extra thin superglue. A little bit of glue got on the outside of the upper air defense platform's splinter shield, so I removed that using sandpaper, and then touch up the area and the top of the support pillars with XF53. That finally completes the modifications to the air defense platforms. When I started working on this area of the ship, these modifications weren't in the guide on the HMS Hood Association's website. I have been working with Pennant 51, the author of the guide that I'm following, to incorporate these changes into his guide, and they are now there. So if you are following the Trumpeter guide from the HMS Hood Association, you will now have the benefit of these instructions being included in that guide. In the next video, I will continue working through the recommendations from the HMS Hood Association, and I'll construct and install the port and starboard lights. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.